Welcome, everyone. It's very good to have you all here, especially to those participants in South Africa who are not all in South Africa. Some of them are here in the Zuid-Afrikahuis, some are in the States, and some are in South Africa. And also to the viewers in the Netherlands and elsewhere who joined us for today, and especially to those here in the room with me today in the Zuid-Afrikahuis here in Amsterdam. I'm really glad and happy that you ventured out through the cold to be here. Hi, Pauline. Thanks also for the warm hospitality given by Angeli and Jamie and the team, and who has taken care of everything here today. You can't see it, but we're ready for the drinks afterwards already. So we're looking forward to that. So the reason or the purpose for this afternoon was really to make it part of the 100-year reflection. I mean, the reflection on the 100 years of inhabiting and being in this building on the Keizersgracht. There was a symposium in May. We've been working on a number of projects, amongst which a book project, which we will speak about later. And I was thinking that perhaps this is a good opportunity then to see also how questions related to decolonization and the really urgent question how to decolonize an institute like the Zuid-Afrikahuis could also pertain and does pertain to the work the chair does, of course, and the work that we do more broadly within the Netherlands in the field of humanities. That's too broad a topic really to discuss here this afternoon, but some of those questions have relevance to colleagues whom I've invited to speak with today. It is in connection with that topic or that problem or question of how to decolonize that I chose the opening image on the screen for today. It's a close-up of a huge painting that hangs in the staircase as you go up to the library here in the building. It was painted by the Dutch painter Oerder, Frans Oerder. And one of the persons who contribute to our publication, Absent Presences, has written about this painting. The painting itself is not very visible if you walk up the staircase, despite its enormous size, because it's painted in very dark colors, and also because it hangs in a rather inconspicuous place. And thirdly, it's quite badly lit, and the state of the painting is it really requires some renovation, I think, to get rid of a thick layer of dust. But attention for this painting through this article that has been written about it, and for it's what the subject is about, but also the materiality of this painting was meaningful to us as editors of this publication. Not only for thinking about the way in which the man on the painting has been portrayed, but also for the portrait itself, the material artifact, and how it hangs here in the Zuid-Afrikahuis like a tightrope tussen twie buildings, to speak with Nathan Trantral. How it makes a historical connection visible that goes past railways, money, laborers, boards, cultural organizations, and so forth. I think this insight, how events, historically, people, practices are connected between the Netherlands and South Africa, is a useful insight, and looking at where that connection starts in South Africa and how it ends here in the Netherlands can teach us quite a lot. Tycho Maas, a colleague with whom I've been in discussion about this afternoon, mentioned last Saturday at the launch of a special issue of Armada something in relation to how South Africa and the Netherlands stand in relation to each other. His remark made me think, so what is it actually? I will tell you what he said in a second. His remark made me ask, what is it that we in the Netherlands can learn from our South African colleagues if we follow that logic through in terms of the primary material that comes from South Africa? And when I asked Tycho about this remark that he made, he gave me the following rather eloquent explanation how he came to that remark. And I will read it. It reads like a little story almost. So this is what he wrote to me. This remark came from a conversation with a colleague from South Africa, a postdoc in theology, who is very much thinking about how to make visible colonial ways of thinking and how to bring indigenous local perspectives into the curriculum. He, the colleague, asked me, Tycho, what are we in the Netherlands considering as that which needs to be decolonized? How many people of color, for example, are working in your department, he asked. Exactly 0, Tycho thought, rather perplexed, and, this is his word, felt like King One-Eye in the land of the blind. But he also realized that he felt rather displaced. Your decolonization, the colleague continued, is not about lives here at all. He meant South Africa. And also it is not about people of color in the Netherlands, but it simply is a finger exercise in penance that has been part of you since your Calvin. And if it is nothing else, then it is a university-based epistemological exercise for white academics. Ouch. Nail on its head in terms of what I'm searching for in the Netherlands, Tycho thought. And that's why I like to work in and with South Africa so much. And then he asked himself, has the neo-colonial white innocence, complicity of the white intellectual, and the long-standing debates about this in South Africa now finally arrived in the Netherlands? Because like a befriended anthropologist has said to him, in many regards, South Africa remains 10 years behind Europe. But for quite a number of issues, Europe might do very well to look at South Africa to see where the road to the next 10 years might be leading them. So that was the remark about this relationship, the tightrope that binds the two together. Daily, I find myself in conversations and in situations where the most interesting stuff related to this question of that relationship and what we can learn from them here, over there, is being discussed or put on the table. But I find myself frustrated because all the time those meetings are either structured and boxed in by an agenda that has a certain moment, period of time allocated to it, or it happens in the sort of serendipitous encountering of one another in the hallways or at the coffee machines, but also then I am usually on my way to somewhere else. And I find it frustrating that there seems never to be a good moment to talk about these things. In the past 5 years as chair of the endowed chair on South Africa, I have met the most amazing people, and I've been in conversations with extraordinary, inspiring fellow academics, intellectuals, change makers, and thinkers in the Netherlands and in South Africa. And in these conversations with them, for which I never have much time to have them properly, and in reading what they write, all kinds of discussions have been emerging in my head. And it is for me then, I think, a big privilege that I have the space here of the symposium this afternoon to make a little bit more concrete in an external way what some of these conversations have been in my head, the forming of them. So it's my privilege really to bring people together this afternoon that I have had very amazing encounters with in the past 5-6 years, and to be able to connect them to each other. I really like that the chair is able to do this. The institution of the chair has this affordance of being able to bring people together. So what I wanted to do for this afternoon was to bring a number of people together to start a range of conversations, not only to take notice of what colleagues in related fields and on topics that touch each other in most amazing and interesting ways can, what that touching is and what it could mean, but also because I'm very curious to sort of eavesdrop into their conversations and see what else might come from that, what possible collaboration maybe, what insights to take into my own research and classroom practices, and so forth. And it is especially that insight, what can we take from the connection between the here and the there, this tightrope, which I sort of saw happening in a class this year that also was part of the reflection behind convening this afternoon. A group of students gave a presentation on the beach as a changing space of encounter in South Africa, the beach and the seaside. And one of the artworks that the group talked about in their presentation, and you can show the next slide, Jamie, was this, oh no, sorry, after this one, yeah, this one. It's a work of art, Beach Day, by a collage artist, Sam Tlengetwa, and he made it using or referencing an earlier artwork by a other artist, Zweletu Mtetwa, that was made in the early 1990s. So this one is from 2009, the other one was from the early 1990s. What you see are people from different ethnicities standing on a beach. There are heads on the water, on the water, and there are some ships at the background. Now the students in their presentation of this were saying things like, by adding the not white families swimming and with typical beach clothing on, by putting them on the beach or by displaying them on the beach, they, or the artists, sorry, I'm reading from Dutch what the students wrote, I didn't translate this into English. The artist is going against a sort of racist idea that the beach is only the domain of white families. They were sort of talking and interpreting this from the history of public utilities and public space that in South Africa under apartheid was strictly segregated. But at the same time, this painting shows those ships and the atypical beach clothing, and they show that this is still a bit of an unusual or uncustomary environment for the Black South Africans. I was very disturbed by this interpretation by the students because I thought it was so devoid of sensitivity towards other histories that are related to beach and sea in the South African context. Also because we had read a poem by Kuleka Putuma, Water, which speaks of the deeply traumatic engagement and experience of water for Black South Africans. But it was the input and the intervention of another student with a Surinamese and art history background that really just put things into place. Because she emailed me references to this artwork. It's by Donovan Nelson and it's called Ibo Landings, also from 2009. It's a series of portraits and it refers to the historical moment in the United States where a group of enslaved people from Nigeria took over charge of the ship on which they were, enforced a landing, and then the historical account is very unclear about what had happened, but consensus is that this group chose suicide above a life as enslaved people on the new continent. And it was with this input from Crystal's side that I realized how difficult it is even to conceive of such other experiences and interpretations from this very specific white Dutch Generation Z perspective. If that story about slavery, enslavement, and also the resistance, it's not just something that people suffered under, but that there were also moments of resistance against it. If that's not sort of part of the story that you get to hear in your home, in your context, at school, and so forth. So it was this intervention that really just underlined for me how important it is to have conversations across all kinds of boundaries, whether they might be disciplinary, national, across generations, across continents, and so forth. And it's my hope that in this afternoon's series of meetings, we will experience what other epistemologies and geographies and positionings can bring us, how it can inspire us in terms of our own work in the classroom and as researchers. So that is the purpose of this afternoon. Now, in thinking about this, I thought, and about the people that I would like to bring together, sort of organically, a number of topics emerged or appeared. I was really happy to hear that one of the speakers here would also at this time be in the Netherlands. So I thought, that gives me a good occasion and reason to bring someone else who's working on something similar also to the house and to see what happens when they engage in conversation with each other, with one another. So Uhuru Falafala, I would like to invite you please to come and sit here, and Hanneke Stuit, I would like to invite you too to come and please take a seat. Is this yours? Was this? Okay. Alsjeblieft. So it's my pleasure to welcome both of you here. Uhuru is currently a visiting fellow from the University of Stellenbosch at the University of Groningen. So she didn't only travel from Stellenbosch all the way to the Netherlands, but also all the way from Groningen to Amsterdam. And you will find, Uhuru, that the distance from Groningen to Amsterdam is much shorter than the distance from Amsterdam back to Groningen, because it's so easy for people from Groningen to come to Amsterdam, but for people from Amsterdam to go all the way to Groningen is so far, really. Anyway, we appreciate it tremendously that you are here this afternoon. We are happy to be able to have put these things together in a way. She's a writer, researcher, activist, archivist, and scholar, I think also an activist in a way, with research interests in critical race studies, material and expressive culture, social movements, and jazz. She's the author of this very recently published collection of poems, Mine, 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 which we will be talking about this afternoon. A range of other publications, amongst others, Malibongwe, that's also been important for one of the contributions in our publication. I won't say too much about that now. You made a sonic documentary, Home is Where the Music Is, and he's working on a collection of essays on knowledges produced from Southern African cosmology. So thanks for being here and welcome. And then next to her, we have Anneke Stuit, my colleague from the University of Amsterdam, where she's a teacher and researcher at the Literary and Cultural Analysis Department. She's currently working on a book that examines South African literature and film to glean new registers for thinking the countryside beyond the trap of dominant and idyllic imaginaries. Oh, the countryside is this nice place. That are actually rooted in devastating colonial habits of thought about enclosure, cultivation, and extraction. And that is foreseen to be published in 2025. So every moment you are here is a bit of a possible delay on the book over there. I realize that, so I appreciate.
Don't tell them I'm here.
I really appreciate it that you are sacrificing some of your precious time to be here. She's the co-editor of volumes Planetary Hinterlands, which places the hinterland and the critique that hinterland offers at the center of global capitalism, and of Carceral Worlds, which offers perspectives from all over the globe on the many ways in which the world is becoming enclosed, increasingly prison-like for people from all walks of life. That will be published early next year or later. Early next year. Okay. So, yes, all of you very productive. Thank you for all of that production. Uru, because this has just recently been published, may I ask you to open with a short reading, please?
Sure. Be glad to.
Maybe could you
approach?
Yes, sure. Yes. That would be fantastic. And maybe could you just in one or two, that's too few, but just very briefly say a little bit about around the text.
Yeah, sure. Okay, greetings everyone. Greetings to our online community as well. Thank you for inviting me to share in the discussions this afternoon. I will be reading from Mine, Mine, Mine. It is an epic that chronicles my grandfather's journey as a migrant laborer. A migrant laborer is somebody who works away, in this case, from my family in the north, Limpopo in South Africa. He had to travel to Johannesburg, which is a long distance, let's just say, and he could only come home 3 weeks in a year during the December Christmas holidays. So he was away for the year and came to visit, as it were, during Christmas. So the book chronicles that. I tried to bring copies for you to be able to purchase, but that was not possible. So we're just gonna have to listen in, and then hopefully you are encouraged to go order. All right, so it's an epic. It's an epic. It's a good 45-page poem. So it's difficult to choose where to read from. So I'm going to read from the coda, which consists of short snippets of poetic moments. Unburied. A moment of silence to listen to the good book, not written in your language. Gather your firstborn sons and all adult males as offerings of your race to the shrine of modernity. Close your eyes and witness in the stillness the hollowing of the stolen, our gutting and scraping by a benevolent mission, extracting our spirits directly out of our bodies, powered by the sweat of our brow. The fall from pastoral heaven into the golden gates of mercantile hell. Hallowed be our names. Open the bone of your heart and feel the smells, the screams of fire flame licking melanated flesh, spontaneous combustion of sulfuric biosphere, gaseous breath ignited by power failures of body count, a blackout. Close your eyes and see the scattered bones, collaterals of colonial conquest, unburied, excavated without libation. The living dead whisper thunderous command, ceremony, ceremony. Where is the ritual, the song, and prayer? Here, now. Hear us. Hear. 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 Close your eyes and hear the wail of grandmother for the seed in the earth that rots in the violence of the underworld, shooting from earth without sprouts to nourish deserted hearts, mouthing supplications to petition presence and grace from the grave. Mother is spirit. Father is body. Son is brain drain in the parched threefold cord of our unburied present. Here lies your monuments, your battle warriors, your venerated mothers, godheads of ancient altars, figurines of your memory. Here lies ceremonial herbs, shattered gods, and clay pots abandoned in unburied graves. Hear the song of your blood. There are gods here, shrines of your sacrifices, horns of your medicines, cords of your births, bones of your death, cowhides of your royals, breath of ancestral prayers, songs of your rebirth. We gravitate toward soil, sink our fingers deep, excavate bone and living flesh. Listen to the ground for our fathers, brothers, husbands, and sons in the heart of dust, damp, and darkness. A directive for Black pregnant women to eat soil and keep sons safely buried in their wombs, away from the tombs of the mines. Maternal instinct to protect, mutilation of Black labor. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was moving. I almost would like to not talk now. Can you tell us a bit about the history? You said already it's about your grandfather and the effect. Why did you want to write poems about it rather than academic article, for example?
Yeah. So the poetry visited itself upon me. There are many ways to answer this question, but today I think of a particular moment in 2019. My parents were in town. I live in Cape Town. They live in the north. They came to visit, and there was an exhibition that I wanted to take them to, and it was called In the Mines by David Goldblatt, whom you might know. And we went to this exhibition with my parents and walked into the halls of the gallery space and did what people do when they visit galleries, read what's on the wall, but you know, we all took our different directions. And I think just 5 minutes in already, I saw my mother with the corner of my eye, and she looked frozen with fear. She was standing there kind of stuck in this huge hall that's filled with beautiful photographs, brutally beautiful photographs. And she was standing there, and I could sense distress. So I went to her, and you know, she was highly distressed. So I said, "What's going on? What are you okay?" And she kind of was trying to look at the photos, but couldn't bring her. She was terrified. She was, you know, in the parlance of today, we'd say she was triggered. She was highly triggered. And she said, "Oh my God, I see these photos and I think about my father who worked in the mines, and he was away most of our childhood and our adult life. And this is where he was. When I look at all of these things and the installation over there with hard hats, I just think of my father." And of course, I knew my father had worked in the mines, but I had never given it deep thought. But in this moment, I saw it lodged, this experience, this trauma in my mother's body. It was clearly something coming up for her in her body. And because I'm an artist, I'm a poet, I pay attention. I look, my work is to witness and to look and never look away and to just kind of stay in the moment. I asked her to tell me more, removing her from the space. We ended up sitting in the gardens of the gallery. She couldn't look at the exhibition. But what struck me was that you know, something like the mining industry is such a hidden affair. It's underground. There's no chance and opportunity to go see what happens underground. It's an unknowable space. It is ubiquitous, so it is the foundation of Southern African modernity. It is prevalent and pervasive. It is the core of global capitalism, but it's out of sight. And I don't assume my mother has been underground. She has not. So she's sensing the unknowable. She's sensing the unknowable in her body, even though she has not physically engaged with this space. There is something about the body that held this knowledge of this mining industry. And for me, that was my starting point, that it is possible to be marked by a history and to have it inscribe you and have an experience of that history even when you have not perhaps personally experienced it yourself. People in epigenetic memory have argued this as well. And I tasked myself to find that history in my own body because I am of my mother. right? So I kind of entered a space of wanting to explore that, wanting to explore this intergenerational experience of racial capitalism. So many times we hear about it. I'm an academic, and I study and research critical race. So apartheid, colonialism, slavery, and all its multiple kind of headed hydras, capitalism, head for patriarchy, classism, all of that. At the time, I had been writing my monograph, like you, busy at work with writing my monograph. But here was this moment now with my mother. And in the same year as I was struggling to think about racial capitalism, I'm a literary scholar, I'm not a political economist, I'm not an economist. So I really was struggling with the concept. The concept of racial capitalism is that the makings of capitalism are inextricably tied to the makings of race. Without race making, there is no capitalism, or capitalism comes through via race making. So I was wanting to articulate these ideas in my academic book, and really struggling and reading broadly theorists who write about racial capitalism, most notably Cedric Robinson. And still it was quite an abstract idea, it was theoretical. And this moment of witnessing my mother and sitting in the space of sensing these histories in our body, that shifted something for me, because it let me know that racial capitalism is not an abstract idea, it's not a theoretical idea to be found in textbook. You could very well find it there, but it is also sitting in my body. It marks me and my experience in coming from a family that has such direct ties with mining and gold extraction. So that's what I did. I carved time to enter into a space that's very different from academic writing, which is very much kind of a particular way that I also like. But it certainly does not involve listening to your body. So for this, I needed to do something else. I knew I had to create space to engage with what we now understand as knowledge production differently. That in this case, as I said in my opening line, the knowledge visited me. I'm not the sole actor upon the knowledge. I created space for that knowledge to reveal itself to me.
Thank you. Yeah, and I can imagine that process also requires quite some time afterwards to settle down, if ever it can, after having been through such a writing process. Maybe we can talk about that a bit later.
You don't ever return to where you were when you began. But I think that's with all art.
Yeah. Hanneke, in your work, the reason why I ask you two together is through this link with working with land and soil. I also like the very specific reference in the poems that you read now to the put your fingers in the soil, Uhuru. But Hanneke, you work very much with the Black anti-pastoral in this project that you've been working on around rurality. And you've been putting that in the context of the Afrikaans plaasroman.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah. I think that connects actually quite strongly, seemingly not, but very, very strongly to, I think, what Uhuru was saying so clearly and so lucidly. What Uhuru was saying so lucidly and elegantly just now is, I think, the sort of what I'm trying to do in this book, although it is an academic endeavor mostly, is trying to be attuned to how cultural expression and art is in itself a way to rethink sort of fixed ways of thinking certain spaces, certain historical periods, certain groups of people as well. Right? And I think this idea of of the coevalness and sort of the continued coevalness of race and capitalism as a dominant twin figure of our times, is something that you see very much actively hidden in a lot of cultural expression. So I would say, like, an expression like yours is something that seeks to go also to stay also maybe with a metaphor of mining, seeks to go vertically, right? Almost like, if I can speak about it in such terms, you would know this perhaps better than me, but to go into the body, into time, into history, and into the land, right? But when we think about the spaces and the people who live around mining, I think that's not really what people see in their mind's eye when they think about a place outside the city or of places of extraction, right? So I'm trying to collect a lot of expressions that try to deal with these spaces differently, and this is why this focus on rurality, that's what it's meant for, to sort of show, like, we look at the countryside in ways that are sort of dominated by agriculture, or that are dominated by forms of nature enjoyment and leisure and nature worship in many ways. But we don't look at other spaces that are also often situated there. Mining is also very much an urban affair in South Africa, and which makes it very different from other places in the world in relation to mining, right? So this strangely hidden situation of something like mining, I feel is like actively covered up by more pleasant ways of looking at places outside the city, which is unfortunately what we call rural or the countryside, right? So this opposition is false, right? But yet in how we reproduce our knowledge about it and the way we try to produce knowledge, these oppositions between countryside and city dominate our inability to see places of extraction properly for what they really are. And this is also where this idea of the anti-pastoral, so it is, you also mentioned it in one of the poems, you mentioned pastoral heaven as something that is only accessible to some people, but not to others, right? So I think that's what I'm working towards.
So in both your approaches and in both your work, what you describe is an uncovering through a critical position of an existential experience which is deeply characterized by what Colin Dyan has called civic death. A kind of, it's not, as you say, Hanneke, something which is nice or there to be for our entertainment, or but it is this very existential suffering and tearing apart of humanness and rendering them as racialized subjects in a hierarchy of races that has been the result of this. But at the same time, Colin Dyan also says that these existential experiences are also giving way to myriad forms of living that are energized through all kinds of other experiences and relationality. Can you say something about that? How through this oppositional thinking and the opposite thinking, it is not that you also recover something. It is not just talking about what is lost, but you are also recovering something. Uru?
Yeah, I've never heard of the civic death, but it brings to mind social death. Orlando Patterson's work on slavery and social death, which really marks the black body within modernity as one that is marked by subjection and abjection and thingification, dehumanization. So they are not human in this colonial modernity, because this modernity is built upon black death and is sustained by black death. And in South Africa, the Monumental Land Act in 1913 really marks that moment where there's land dispossession for the black person. And it's really beautifully theorized by Solomon Plaatje, who was one of the founders of the ANC back in the day, who says that that moment of the Land Act marks not only the moment where the black South African becomes a slave, but a pariah in the land of his birth. So that sense of exile that happens in that moment of being dispossessed and disconnected from the land is so potent, because it's not only an exile from the land, which, you know, is so vital, but it opens up exiles from various other things: economic system, social structure, family structure, spiritual worlds. And what the apartheid government was able to do was create this tension between the rural and the city along gender lines. So only boys and men could go to the city and work. And there was a whole law that prohibited women from visiting them in the city. It's like the most evil kind of social restructuring, that the boys and men can be in the city and then the women and children can be on the countryside for, quote, continuation of rural production. And that's something I critique very much. The continuation of rural production is not only the continuation of agricultural production, but it is the continuation of reproductive production. So the production of more boys and men to work in the mines. And so there is something very sinister and that then taints the countryside as this place of a different kind of extraction, which is reproductive labor extraction, the extraction of black women's wombs for purposes of profit, right? So there is that we have to keep in mind. But to your point, there's also, and I'm very much invested in that as an approach, poetics of possibility.
Yeah.
How I'm sitting here right now is also just a miracle. I was not supposed to be here by the designs of such a system that I've just explained. But how did we manage to make life? How did we manage to make beauty? How did we manage to make meaning and family and relationality? And, you know, that is for me also a point of excavation, if we are to use the mining metaphor. It's important to also look into what we have been able to live through against the uninhabitable, the unlivable. What are the kind of strategies of not only survival, but of living and thriving that we've been able to strategize? And I think that the spiritual worlds of black people, of Africans, is something that has not been able to be touched, incarcerated, colonized, killed, maimed, lynched, jailed by colonial forces. This has been the one kind of strata of life central to Africans themselves that has not been able to be captured by colonial forces. And I think it's precisely because this European modernity is very material. It's a material fundamentalist kind of system. So spirit is gibberish in the world of the European modern man with an upper M, but in fact for the African it's a central organizing system for life.
Yeah, thank you. Anneke?
Yes, I think thank you for that. I think that's beautifully said, really. I think what's so fundamental about a fundamental notion, I think that needs to be addressed, like philosophically, but also the way that is embodied. Maybe I'm speaking from a wide perspective here, but that is sort of this need for enclosure. Right? So you mentioned it very briefly in the introduction, but this idea where an idyllic life or a good life depends on having a stretch of land that is yours to do with as you see fit, and to as you refer to in relation to the gender difference between countryside and city, that can only be visited by certain people in certain ways and under certain constraints. Right, so this idea of the idyll, it's a very old tradition, which does not necessarily make it a good one, right? But I'm just trying to say how ingrained it is, because it is so old. This idea of pastoral renditions of space, this can be the countryside. There's also a city idyll. There's also such a thing as, like, there could potentially even be a mining idyll, preferably not, but it could be. For a landlord, maybe the mine is an idyll, right? So it really depends on where you're standing, on how such a place can be romanticized. However, on the receiving end of that, in some work I've called this sort of an idyllic carceral continuum, in how we look at the romanticization of space. But on that carceral side, that doesn't mean there is not life. It doesn't mean there is no joy, there's no love, and there's no production or reproduction of whatever nature, as you also just mentioned, right? So once you can sort of switch gear, which is very difficult to do, and I'm not saying I'm better at this than other people, it is really but an important idea, as Ajil Mbembe has called it in 2019. It's a need for disenclosure. Right, so you think about space differently. You try to think about yourself differently. And that is a figure of freedom, right? So it's a philosophical idea that he sort of takes a lot of pains to explain, lots of pages and pains to explain. But a very elegant and simple one is, if you take enclosure seriously, both as a actual situation in the world and in the land, and with carceral effects for people, but also as a metaphor for your heart, there needs to be an unfolding and a disenclosing. An opening up of not just boundaries, but precisely the materiality of that, right? So why is this fence here? So I think when you sort of think about it from that perspective, there is, although a very difficult line of thought, very difficult to imagine, because enclosure is so dominant in Western culture, I would say. I'm not saying other cultures don't have it, but in Western culture, it's very, very dominant indeed. And I think that care, a form of care, lies in taking care of how to not do that. That would be my positive.
In any case, as a way of thinking.
Yes,
In
but
dealing
also
with the
literally.
subject matter. Yeah.
Especially in a place like South Africa.
Yeah.
I read a lot of American material as well on decolonization questions. This is by now famous article by Tuck and Yang called "Decolonization is Not a Metaphor." Right? It is a very material. It's not just a finger exercise, also not for white people.
I like the meditation on enclosure, because, you know, this moment of being rendered a pariah in the land of your birth is this moment of exile also from your world into another world. You're co-opted into a kind of colonial existence and colonial geography, a white settler geography, so that in itself is a capturing into another world outside of your own. So the field of Black studies and artists and writers in South Africa and beyond have been thinking through modalities of rupturing the capture. How do we rupture the enclosement? How do we get out, so to say, you know? And there are various ways, because this world is not the only existing world, even though colonialism would like us to think there is. So how do we inhabit multiple worlds?
Yeah.
And that is where the role of spiritual lives and practices come in, to be able to have a double, triple location of time and space.
Yeah, depicting different experiences, different places, like in York, beyond the place, beyond the farm, thinking about outside the city, beyond a farmstead. What else is going? Other beings, other ecologies, other ways of experiencing modernity, time.
Yes.
I'm I'm afraid that I'm going to
You're going to
Enclose
enclose us.
Enclose us.
We will fight
Yeah.
to be free.
I feel really terrible to intervene at this point, but I would first of all like to say this call or this question: how can we and do we inhabit multiple worlds, and to think of the opening up, the beyond non-enclosure, the disenclosure. I think those are extremely powerful and provocative questions, and almost like instructions for us to continue thinking about. So I would like to pause this conversation for a few minutes so that we can start with the next conversation. In our minds, I hope this conversation will in any case echo, and perhaps questions can be forming in your minds. Please, may I thank you for your contributions here, and I hope that when we go for drinks, we will continue this discussion and in time to come. Thank you both so much. It's like the chair being a parody of itself, having to close off something like this. All right, on to the next conversation. I am very happy to welcome now to the floor Bibi Berger, who is joining us from the States, Azil Kutsia, who's joining us from Cape Town, and Maragje Paimans, who's joining us here in Amsterdam. Yes, Maragje, please come and have a chair here. So from soil and land, we are moving to water. When I was thinking about this afternoon, and I tried to pick Maragje's brain for some interesting topics and ideas, and then she said, water, I would like to speak about water. And I thought that's such a good idea, because I know of people in South Africa who's also working on this topic. So let's see what happens if I bring people together who work on the same topic, but from vastly different positions, and see how. I would like the three of you to meet each other, those two know each other very well already. But what happens when you bring in another element into the conversation? So please let me introduce briefly the conversants in this discussion. Azil Kutsia over here is a writer and a postdoctoral researcher at Stellenbosch University. Jamie, did we lose them? Okay. In her research, she looks at the decolonizing power of feminist and queer thinking, and her work has been published in a range of scholarly journals, but she's also the author of a memoir, In My Vel, 'n Reis, and a novel, Die Teenoorgestelde is net so waar. And she's a co-creator and instigator, I can say, of a feminist newsletter, Turks Vij, a feministische brief in Afrikaans, together with Bibi. And it was my pleasure a couple of months ago to speak with the two of them about this initiative. So her partner in crime, in a way, is Bibi Berger, who is a lecturer in Afrikaans and Dutch at the University of Cape Town, so the other university in the Cape. One of the other, there are those three. She's an Isolomso research, research fellow at the Stellenbosch Institute for Advanced Studies. Isolomo is Xhosa for Eye of the Future. And it's there for young researchers who, not more than 7 years ago or something like that, finished their PhDs, to allow them to continue doing research. And in that context, in that sense, she is now conducting research on the relation between space and gender in Afrikaans literature at the National Humanities Center in the USA. Thanks, Bibi. It's early in the morning for you, so that's also strange in terms of these multiple worlds, that it's your morning while we are at the end of our afternoon already, and that brings a certain strange dynamic, I think, to the discussion when we have different chrono times playing a role in this discussion. And then thirdly, I would like to welcome Maragje. Maragje is a fellow colleague of mine at the University of Amsterdam, where she teaches Dutch literature. She received the KNAW Early Career Award last year for her research on post-colonial and eco-critical perspectives on 17th century literature. And her work has been published in a range of prestigious journals: Cultural History, Journal for Early Modern Cultural Studies, and Foucault Studies. And recently she embarked on a new project with the title How to Welcome the Water, reimagining our life with water through marginalized stories in the Neerlandophone space. So that was the starting point for this discussion. Welcome all three of you. Thanks very much for joining us here in Amsterdam. What I would like to do is first give you all, I said in the beginning 5 minutes, but we're going to cut it down to 3. To talk about, briefly, tell me a little bit about the research and the work that you're doing in which water plays a role, because we need to establish some common ground here before we can really get going. And how does that research relate to the national, the post-national, the post-colonial, and the colonial context? Let me see. Bibi, shall I start with you?
That's fine. Thank you, Margriet. First, can I ask, Margriet, can you maybe move closer to the middle of the stage so that Azal and I can see you? It feels a bit weird to talk.
Jamie's suggestion from the beginning. So, Jamie, I concede here your far superior knowledge and insight about the spatial organization in this room. Okay, is this better, Bibi?
Thank you. That's perfect.
Okay.
Yes, perfect. Thank you. But now you can't see us, but hello. I'll try to keep it short. My research these last few years have often been about how water features in South African poetry. So Afrikaans and English language poetry. I look specifically at Uhuru's collection as well, even though soil and mining is the most important theme or motif. Water is also an undercurrent in the collection. Then I also look at Ronelda Kamfer's poetry, Jolyn Phillips, and Kuleka Patuma, which Margriet also mentioned. I work with theorists like Paul Gilroy and in South Africa, Isabel Hofmeyer, who argued that the ocean or oceanic roots is how colonialism and slavery was spread across the globe, but also how opposition to these systems were spread through dynamic and vital cultural connections and language interactions. So I argue that these collections can be seen as products of these oceanic roots. Then I also look at the ocean as a spiritual realm, where often the poets figure the ocean as a place or a means of communing with the ancestors or with history. Also the idea of the ocean as symbolic of a submerged or repressed history. And in some of the collections, there's also emphasis on people who live very closely with the ocean, symbiotically as a means, fishing communities, that kind of thing, which is contrasted with the colonial extractive approach to the ocean, the hunting of whales, the attempt to, in the same way that the land is divided and colonized and disciplined, they attempt to have the same approach with the ocean. And especially in the Ronelda Kamfer's poetry, the ocean is also this realm of imagination, of trying to imagine an other world that is in our world, but is sort of the opposite of it. That's a carnivalesque type of space. Okay, I'll stop there for now.
Already quite a lot. I've been taking notes as you were speaking. Thank you very much, Bibi. Azil, what about you? Because you are not a literary scholar, although you write about literature all the time and you incorporate literature in the most beautiful way in your work as a feminist philosopher. So can you tell us a bit about how that works and why it is an important theme for you to work with when we speak about water?
Hi, everyone. Yes, I think I am interested, or my interest in water has been in that it represents different ways of knowing, especially, but also being. So if I pick up from where Hanneke was saying about the colonialism as a system of enclosure, also that also happens in our modes of knowledge production and in the ways in which we know the world. We fracture the world into binary hierarchies or hierarchical binaries, man, woman, black, white, nature, culture, all of that. And our knowledge systems are infused with this, and then it allows us only very limited ways to see the world that inevitably perpetuate colonial power structures like racism, patriarchy, capitalism, all of it. So then even if you start looking like a body of knowledge like African philosophy, and my field is philosophy, that's why it's interesting to me. Some of these, even if it's a body of knowledge that very deliberately and intentionally tries to think in different ways, what happens is it absorbs some of these hierarchies and binaries. For example, the very rigid man-woman binary, which even if the discipline wouldn't admit to it, you can see it from the near absence of Black African women philosophers. Of course, there are a few, but by far the minority working in the field. So then you go ask, where are Black women thinkers, Black African women thinkers expressing their kind of philosophical thoughts? And most often and most clearly and beautifully, that is happening in artistic spaces like literature and the arts more generally. And there you see water used in very specific ways, and a real focus on water in many of the Black women's work. We've mentioned a few of them now: Kuleka Putuma, Jolyn Phillips. Bibi has mentioned that it's also in Uhuru's work, and many other places, Yvonne Veer. Well, the list is endless. And water figures as it's symbolic for different ways of being, different ways of seeing the world, different cosmological kind of understandings of who we are. But it also works more materially in how people relate to nature, to space, to themselves, to other beings. So if you start looking at water in that sense, you get a very different kind of knowledge and a very different kind of way of doing philosophy. So that's how I have been looking at water.
Thank you. And then I'm really curious to hear Margie's response about water, because here in the Netherlands, of course, the relationship with water is quite different from how it works in South Africa. So what draws you to water, and how does water, or how do you think water will be working and figuring it in this new project of yours?
Yeah, exactly. Does this work? Yeah? Okay. Hi, Azil and Bibi. Thank you so much. And yeah, compared to you, I'm a complete newcomer to the sort of terrain of water, because my research has been now for like 10 years about 17th century Dutch literature, but I'm using contemporary theory to open up new perspectives. My method is not so much to criticize the ideologies that 17th century people had, because to me that seems sometimes rather purposeless. But
They are not going to change, you mean?
no, it's good to that we are aware of them, but it can become sort of a repetitive exercise. So what I prefer to do is that I look into marginalized voices in those 17th century Dutch texts, which is a very difficult exercise, which involves a lot of historical work and looking into unexpected and difficult to find sources sometimes. And in this new project, so how to welcome the water, this departs indeed from the role that water has in the Netherlands, the fact that the rising seawater, surface water, groundwater is imminent, and that there is going to be a point where we have to let it in, or we are already letting it in. Although I believe that there is no dominant or reliable Dutch narrative apart from the battle against the water that can help us to deal and to live with this water in a sustainable way. And especially if you take this intersectional perspective that I have of post-colonialism and eco-criticism, then it becomes quite noticeable that the Netherlands doesn't have dominant narratives about living with the other, either ecological other or colonial other at all. If you think in terms of tolerance or integration, these narratives have proved to be rather unsustainable and exclusive. So what I aim to do in my project is to look for, also from this post-colonial eco-critical intersection, to look for more productive stories about the life with water, especially in areas that have been colonized by the Netherlands, to see whether those stories can teach us something or contribute to the way in which Dutch people think about water and do not live with water. For example, I think about Surinamese African legends or Winti religion. As you were saying, like, I think spirituality might be a very important aspect of this study. I'm also thinking about a research of shells that I've been doing. Like, shell is an exotic what do you call it, commodity that was traded in the 17th century a lot, especially from Indonesia, former Indonesia, and and how these shells, these little objects, made people in the Netherlands think about where they came from, how they were, where they were found, how often there was also slavery involved into the finding, like, for example, the pearl divers in Indonesia and in South America. And often this happened in terms of fragility and of homeliness, like the shell is a little house, in relation to water. So these are the kind of narratives that I'm now thinking about. And South Africa, I think, can be very important in my research. I think there's also somebody behind the window.
Yeah. That's our speaker for the next panel.
Oh,
I'm really happy that she's
Carina.
knocking on the window.
I'm happy too then, yeah. I think to wrap up, South Africa, of course, people that lived in Suriname, they brought their cultures from Africa, maybe also from South Africa. I don't know yet exactly how that worked, because also I'm a newcomer to research into South African culture. But I'm interested in how these stories about water empowered people, enabled them to live, to see beauty, to make families, all those things you were saying, or offer resistance against colonizers. And through those stories, I hope to sort of confront the dominant narratives about water in the Netherlands and open new perspectives for more sustainable ways of living with water.
Thank you. What strikes me so much when listening to what you three talk about is how you have been moving beyond sort of the confines of the field, so to speak. Bibi, you are a little bit irreverent to linguistic borders and also work with literature in other languages. Azil, you're quite disrespectful of disciplinary borders, and you bring in material from elsewhere. Margie, you are really discarding national borders and saying, what can we learn from other places, other areas, although there is this strong colonial connection, of course. So that strikes me as something important in what you do, how looking further and beyond and transcending certain conventions, conventional borders, enables you to do what it is that you are doing. But when we prepared this, the next question was going to be, how is your research tied to colonial processes and processes of decolonizing? And so perhaps this moving beyond is part of that answer. Bibi, can I start again with you? And before you start, let me just pour Margie some water, because I forgot to do that at the beginning. Be a good hostess.
Very ironic that she didn't get her water.
Thank you, Robert. Bibi.
I have to think where to start. I think, yes, I think for me, it's not as if Afrikaans literature, my discipline, hasn't looked transnationally before. It has. But from our perspective, which maybe is the opposite from the Dutch perspective, we usually look to the Netherlands or to Belgium to make these comparisons. So I think for me, the value of looking, especially at what I talked about earlier, the oceanic roots, this is an aspect that I haven't really developed in my work as yet. I see the collections that I talk about as the product of both colonial but also anti-colonial routes that came through the ocean. But I think it also opens up the possibility of different kinds of comparison. So, for example, I think South African literary scholars, the only scholar I know who has looked at this really is Stewart van Wyk. So he has done a little bit about the connections between Suriname literature and Afrikaans Black literature. But I think that is a field that really needs to be expanded, that we look at these different countries that were colonized by the Netherlands and put them into conversation with each other. I'm sure there are other people who have done it. That's just the only one that I'm really aware. It's not a major undertaking in Afrikaans literature. And even here in the US, on the one hand, you don't want to perpetuate US cultural hegemony. But reading poetry here, I also see a lot of connections between Afrikaans literature and some contemporary American literature, which excites me and I think opens up the possibility for further examination. Again, it's not as if the US has a completely different history to South Africa. We have many raakpunte points of connections, which I think would make this possible. And I do think looking at literary history from this perspective can be fruitful in terms of, I hesitate to use the word decolonization for the reasons that Hanneke named earlier. You don't want to make it a symbolic act only, but it is a way of opening up the curriculum and how I teach and look at Afrikaans literature. Sorry, I'm still thinking through these processes, so I don't know if my answer was that
Yes, what
clear.
I wrote down, what I think is important is that from an Afrikaans literary point of view, in any case, there are interesting possibilities to look at other points of connection than just the conventional Dutch, Flemish, the sort of dominant ones, which also I think have been there through all kinds of racialized conceptions of connection. And if you become critical of that and aware of that, then you start seeing possibilities for other connections, or you become aware of the other experience that the racialized connection hasn't been able to see or recognize yet. And that's perhaps also a topic that we will talk about in the third panel. And about the classroom practices, I would like us, if there's time, to briefly reflect on that in the next question. But let's first move to Azil and then again to Margje.
Yeah, so I'm gonna not answer your question completely directly, but rather raise another point that I think fits in very well here. So Catherine McKittrick writes in her latest book, Dear Science, that disciplinary boundaries, that's part of the colonial enclosures, and that in a way these disciplines are also kind of encoded with Black death and colonial power structures and all of it in different ways. And also they encode you can only ask, every discipline, she writes, encode already leads you to only certain kinds of questions. The answers to those questions are built into the disciplines themselves. So if we stick to our existing disciplinary boundaries, we are going to keep asking the same questions and getting the same answers, and that's not going to get us any further. So, and that's where water is such a good kind of epistemological metaphor, or because it's about it interests me as something that leaks and steeps and mixes and moves and flows, and so if it's helpful in that sense to think of it as different kind of metaphor for how we know, which should be, if we are serious about decolonization and knowing differently, it should be beyond existing disciplinary boundaries.
Thank you, Azil. And you raise a point which, in a number of contributions or things that have been said, has already been raised, but in different formulations. But it goes directly, Uhuru, to something you said, the tomb of the mind. How we need to find strategies and tools to weaponize ourselves or to become fit against this tomb of the mind type of situation. Marigje?
Yeah. So the question was about how we relate water to decolonizing. Oh, excuse me. Yeah. The question was how we relate completely.
So I should just explain to the people watching, when we don't speak through the microphone, you don't hear us. So Jamie made that very evident just now, because we were not doing
I'm
that.
just so used to wearing a headset, so yeah. No. So the question was about the relation between decolonizing practices and water, right?
Yeah, it's how the water relates to this process of decolonizing in your work
Yeah.
or in the questions you're asking.
Okay, yeah. So firstly, I'm really grateful for all the ideas already that Azil and Bibi are mentioning to me, and I would really like to enclose conversation with you and hear more about also what present-day artists in South Africa, what kind of work they're making. Because also what I've noticed is that when you're doing research into, for example, the Suriname sources, it's often oral history, so it's noted down in books that have been published very recently, but they describe oral traditions that go back to the 17th century or maybe even the 16th century. It's a completely different way than doing research as a European historian, because then it's always, when was that edition published in that year? So it's only relevant to that year and 5 years before or 5 years after. Whereas with this oral tradition, it is relevant for 500 years. It's a completely different way of thinking. So also time becomes very different, and the present-day artworks can be related in very different and maybe more free ways as well to ancient sources. So in my own research, to give an example of how I try to find these marginalized voices in Dutch literature. An example that I have been working on is by a poet, Dutch poet who lived in Suriname, Paul François Roos. He wrote Surinamese mengelpoëzie, so mixed poetry. It was published in 1804. So he was a Dutch man who owned a plantation and has a very Dutch white colonial perspective on the life on the plantation. And it's often a very limited and painful view that he has. So Roos, for example, he describes an expedition was done in 1790 to punish the Marons that were living in the Surinamese jungle, that were led by Bonny. He's a very famous Suriname hero, resistance hero. And they have built their fortress in a sort of a cataract in the Marowijne River of Suriname. And then Roos describes this, I fear it's in Dutch, but I can explain it a little bit in English. Waar Marowijne met haar zware golven vloeit, daar rots en bank bij bank de grootste scheepvaart boeit. So the Dutch boats cannot go through. Haar oevers daveren doet door steile watervallen en Suriname scheidt van het vaste strand der Gallen. So from Frans-Guyana, which is next to Suriname. In het midden van die stroom had op een hoog stuk land de grijze Bonny, de grijs means the wise, grijze Bonny het rot der roverige plant. So the fortress of the thieves, the robbers. So here clearly Roos sort of identifies the nature of Suriname, also in the entire poem, but especially as well the water with the Marons. So he really believes that the nature of Suriname is on the side of the Marons, whereas the Marons were not even from South America, they were from Africa, but he clearly sort of identifies them, and that happens a lot in his poetry. And And what I find very interesting is that the Marrons have also appropriated this image. So there is, if you read Anton de Kom now, you see how he describes how the Marrons run like the deers, and they were strong like the jaguars in the jungle. And you can see this as a sort of an exotification. But on the other hand, it was also a story that really empowered the Marrons, and the jungle was also their area where they were stronger. And that is also what makes Suriname so special, because it has so much jungle. It was possible for a big Marron population to survive and attack the plantation continuously. So these little entrances in poems I find really interesting, and if you study them with Surinamese research, then a whole world lies hidden in such a little sentence. I can give another example, or is that enough?
Maybe that's enough for the
Okay.
time being. Maybe we can discuss it over a glass of wine to talk about that other example.
Yeah, sure. I will talk to you about my other example over a glass of
No,
wine.
because I also here, it's like
If you prefer.
it's
Yeah.
like a drop of water that sort of slips through a crack, a small fissure that then opens up
Yeah.
all kinds of. It's
Yeah.
a very naughty little drop of water that opens, that enters in this way the space of Dutch literary
Yeah.
research, and I think it is really quite powerful in doing that. It's also upsetting all kinds of ideas and delivered. Conceived knowledge and ideas that have been handed over about what happened over there in the Dutch public mind. To conclude, because we have to give the third panel space as well, I would like to ask you in a very short answer, please. What do you think from your position at this moment is the most urgent issue that needs to be addressed in your field if we want to take the call to decolonize knowledge structures or to decolonize our teaching practices serious? Keeping in mind also that what it means in the Netherlands is maybe vastly different from what it means in South Africa. What would it be for each of you three at this moment? So it's quite a personal question. You don't have to speak on behalf of the field, but I would like to hear what it means for you as a colleague. Let's start with Margje. Oh, sorry.
Microphone back. Yeah, so I'm in the Department of Dutch Studies, Dutch Language and Culture. So it's a huge challenge for us. And because we are based on 19th century nationalist ideas, that was when these studies was created. And it was completely implicated in colonialism, providing all sorts of narratives for slavery and for colonization. That is what we have to deal with. And the problem is also that the Department of Dutch Literature is shrinking. It has been shrinking for 20 years. And at this moment, we have a sort of group of students, 30 students per year. So we also really like to victimize ourselves and say how difficult it is already to keep the department going, and then to also work on decolonization processes. And so there is our student population is not completely, but it is rather wide and with Western backgrounds. Same for our staff, not completely white, but almost entirely.
A little bit similar to what Tycho said when he was asked.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
I think Amsterdam is slightly different, because here in Amsterdam there's a very strong Surinamese community, which is also slightly present in our students and in our staff. What we're trying to do, there are actually I am part of a diversity committee of our department, and recently also the faculty of the humanities has there is a new faculty diversity officer. And we're trying to connect to those faculty-brought initiatives. So what we have done, for example, we have a new postdoc, which is researching Surinamese literature by Edgar Caro, and she is now in Paramaribo. We have a teacher in residence, or we are actually looking at this moment for a teacher in residence, which will be focusing on diversity and what we can do to make our students feel more at home, and also to reach out to potential students in places where we have traditionally not received many students from. Yeah, and we're also trying to we're creating a fund to bring sort of incorporate diversity and decolonization practices into our teaching, so that we can invite people to talk about topics that maybe we're not entitled or to talk about, or not in every way possible. Yeah, so we are undertaking a lot of things actually recently. Yeah.
And so these are quite concrete steps
Yeah.
rather than curricular changes.
Yeah, because we feel like we have also gone through, for example, we have completely changed our course philosophy of the humanities, which was one linear, sort of story about white men improving upon themselves. And yeah, and it was really a challenging exercise, because if you start integrating new people, you start by looking for female philosophers and black philosophers who can tell the same story, so that you can incorporate them in your program. And then you realize, no, these people do not exist, because they have different stories.
Yeah.
So your entire program is going to change, and you have to really think about what indeed are the disciplinary boundaries of philosophy, what are the disciplinary boundaries of the humanities. And that was, it sounds very logical, but if you have to make a course, and you know that in 2 months you have to stand there and sort of give a proper instruction to students, it's really challenging to find sort of something that makes a whole program. And still, you don't actually, that is also a problem. You're looking for an enclosed story to tell, maybe, and you
realize that's not possible. But that is valuable insight, I guess.
Yeah, but it remains a challenge.
Yeah, sure.
But it's good.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Thank you. Azil.
Yeah, I think I can connect almost directly there. And mine is again more on the level of how we are making knowledge, how we're generating knowledge. And I think for me, it's about tracing different kinds of genealogies of thought, a politics of irreverence, as Margarita said, kind of, because if we stay in the lines that we inherit from the canonical forefathers, or that we get from the discipline proper, then a few old white Europeans are dictating the terms of the entire conversation. And as you said, Marietje, which kinds of stories can be part of the disciplinary structures or frameworks. And so it's about finding different genealogies of thought that can speak on different terms and open things up in new ways. So I would say something like that.
For you, Bibi?
So I agree with a lot of what both of you have said. I don't think the situation is that different in South Africa from what Margie, sorry if I mispronounce your name, has described. We also have smaller classes. There's also the issue of not just incorporating, not just changing the face of who is teaching the discipline, but seeing how that affects the discipline itself. It cannot be merely about representation. But I want to say something a bit different, just to not repeat them. I think one of the crises that all South African universities, and not just Afrikaans, is struggling with at the moment is that the subsidization keeps shrinking, and the funding keeps shrinking, and they're restructuring the bursary scheme in a way that means that a lot more students are without funding. So it's still the urgent cry of fees must fall. University fees need to be less. Universities need to be less business enterprises, so that more students can have access to them. I think that is a very urgent issue that we see the effects of every day.
Bibi. I think that's such an important point to close off with. And I also heard you, Marije, mention that in your new diversity teacher speaking to, so looking at the structural conditions and contexts that keep students from entering or that hinders them from participating. I think it is so important for us to be aware of that, how it's not just a matter of the stuff we teach, but also what are the material possibilities and restraints that enable or disable people to participate in joining this context.
Gave the coffee table. It's sort of a celebration that is organized here in Amsterdam. I spoke to a student, history student. Excuse me. I spoke to at a certain celebration. I spoke to a history student from Sierra Leone who studied here for 5 years already, and he told me that at no point had he ever felt welcome, and he at the University of Amsterdam, and he also has been to the Free University of Amsterdam, and he said there were spaces where I immediately felt welcome. And I said, like, I do not have this sense. You know, I as a white privileged person, I walk into those spaces and I have no sensation whatsoever, and something that he can immediately make out like this difference. And I was also completely shocked, of course, by the fact that he had never felt welcome.
Yeah, so that's the important point then, to also continue talking what then needs to change. All right, this time time's really up, so we have to stop here. Thank you all three so much for joining me in this conversation. I'm really happy that I was able to introduce the three to each other, and I hope that more talking and engagement will follow from this. I'm thinking how we can set up maybe continuing the conversation. You're welcome to stay for the last panel. Thank you so much for being here with us this afternoon for now. Thanks. And then I would like to ask Werner, could you please give me 2 more glasses and fill the jug of water, please? And then I would like to welcome and invite to the stage, yes, Soese and Barbara.
Hey, sure.
Thank you. So please have a seat. Good to see you. Very, very, very. We start. I just want to say I wasn't that really shifted. You're not going to the yes. Yeah. All right, and our concluding conversation for this afternoon is between Soese Mettler and Barbara Henkes, and it will be convened and moderated by Karine Zijman. And it is a continuation, I hope, of a conversation that started already. Let me think, where are we now? In November, I think in early October or end of September. End of September. We sat together. We is Barbara, Andre, who's in the audience, and myself, together with Anjali and with Soese. Nasima was there as well, if I remember correctly. And we started talking about 2 projects that are being run at the moment within this 100-year celebration about and around the Zuid-Afrikahuis. The exhibition that Soese is working on, and which parts of is already visible, and a collection of essays that Barbara, Andre, and myself are working on. So about both projects, we'll hear a little bit more, I hope, in detail. But let me just quickly, briefly introduce the 3 participants. Cruzay here is from South Africa, born in Queenstown, Kumani to be precise, in the Eastern Cape, but raised in Bloemfontein in the Free State. She graduated from the University of Free State in 2022 with an honors in anthropology, specializing in cultural anthropology. But now she extensively worked in the community of Heidendal, Bloemfontein, and participated in intercultural exchanges at the university. Her passion for heritage drives her work, and exploring narratives that are not always mainstream, but the other undercurrents. That is really what part of this exhibition is about as well, but let me not talk too much about that. She's currently completing a master's degree in museum and heritage studies in the Netherlands, and her focus has been exploring the relationship between South Africa and the Netherlands in this study. And she's currently curating an exhibition, Ties with South Africa, in the Zuid-Afrikahuis. Welcome. Then the other participant is Barbara Henkes, historian and currently research associate at the history department of the University of Groningen, and a freelance publicist and an old friend of mine. Her research focuses on forms of social and political inclusion and exclusion in modern history, as she shows and demonstrates in her book Negotiating Racial Politics in the Family, Transnational Histories Touched by National Socialism and Apartheid, that was published in 2020, and Public Histories on Traces of Slavery Past in the North of the Netherlands. And she just recently did a sort of marathon run in Friesland related to these traces of slavery. So we're glad to have you safely back all the way from Friesland, Barbara. Her work is informed by questions that investigate how violent forms of exclusion and repression in the past continues and reverberates in the present, and is productive in contemporary society. And then it is my pleasure also to welcome Karine Zaiman, who will moderate this discussion. As an artist, curator, and scholar, she commits herself in her work to critical engagement with colonial archives and collections, and specifically those that hold strands of the cuckoo past. Her work focuses on the afterlives of slavery and colonialism, particularly in the Cape, and by bringing intangible and neglected histories into view. So there's a very interesting similarity here between making visible, which is otherwise remaining unseen or invisible. Her research aims contribute to a radical reconsideration of colonial archives and museum collections, especially by assisting in finding ways to release their hold over our imagination when we narrate the past, as well as how we might shape the future of it. So the sort of radical imaginary potential of the archive. She's attached to the Research Center for Material Culture of the which is the prestigious research institute for the Dutch Wereldmuseum. I welcome you as well. Thank you so much, all three of you, for continuing this conversation that we started in the Bestuurskamer a couple of weeks ago. And I'd like to give the floor to you, Karine.
Hello, everybody, and thank you so much for the invitation, and thank you also so much, Rosa and Barbara, for agreeing to be in this conversation with me. And Margriet, as you were saying, that these lines of thinking about what has been rendered silent and out of view, I think, is something that binds us our interest together, but also something that I was hoping. I'm a little bit short for this mic. Thank you. Woo! Yeah, brilliant. Thank you so much. It's also something I wanted to explore somewhat in this conversation and through your project. So I was hoping that each of you could provide a very brief, like only a few minutes, just an introduction about your exhibition here and you for the volume. I don't know which of you would like to start.
Who wants to start? Well, as you see, I have my coat on, and this remembers me to the HASA conferences, always in June in South Africa. We're always freezing in the universities. And so this is a bit the same situation now. Excuse me for my coat, but it's nice and warm. Thanks for the invitation and the opportunity to introduce the next edition of the Zuid-Afrikahuis series called Absent Presences in Zuid-Afrikahuis, edited, Margriet said already, by Margriet, André Paijmans, and myself. Well, we wanted to start, because of the 100 years Zuid-Afrikahuis, we wanted to stimulate a reflection on what the house and its various collections and objects has to offer to the analysis of the historical South African, Dutch, or Netherlands entanglements. So our main question with which we approached potential authors was, what happens to how we understand the Zuid-Afrikahuis, its history, its furnishing, and its collection, when we start looking at it with a critical decolonizing lens? We therefore invited authors to select an object, text, artifact from the house's collection and consider what happens when we take such perspectives. How can we read along and against the grain in order to reveal some of those absent presences? Whose voice do we get to hear? Whose faces are we going to see? What forms of transnational whitenesses are constructed in the existing collections and in the furnishing of the house itself? And what is necessary to deconstruct them? So the next step was to approach potential authors. At our first author meeting, we were confronted with our own limitations when Christie van der Westhuizen, present through a Zoom connection, pointed the elephant in the bestuurskamer where we met, the lack of authors and editors of color. And with the absence, the lack of opportunity to present a more layered picture of the absent presences in the Zuid-Afrikahuis. Fortunately, and thanks to the opening of the artistic spaces you were talking about, or your panel was talking about, and you presented as well, we have since been able to involve authors such as Nkule Mabaso, Ronalda Kamfer, and Nathan Tantraal, who look at the artifacts in and around the Zuid-Afrikahuis with a distinct critical view. All the same, it was at first a hard confrontation with the wideness of our own academic and non-academic networks, but equally about the wideness of the people in decisive positions of the Zuid-Afrikahuis. There may be a few more visitors of color coming in, but the decision-making structures where priorities are formulated, both in the Netherlands and in South Africa, are still predominantly white. And this brings me to some of the methodological and ethical issues that we faced as editors. Thanks to some contributions to the volume, we were confronted with an acute awareness that some people feel unwelcome in the Zuid-Afrikahuis. And this connects to the remark of the VU and the University of Amsterdam. I think too, it is obvious that the VU is more welcoming to students of color than when you go around the University of Amsterdam. And so it is the case that some visitors do not feel at ease because of the furnishing of specific objects, while we ourselves have no problem to fit in. So regardless of a welcoming reception by the staff, the furnishing of this house is important for the exclusion or inclusion of a new group of visitors. And that brings me to my last point. I want to touch on briefly the targeted audience for the volume, Who do we want to reach with our volume Present Absences? And with the exhibition, for that matter. Do we want to show the existing group around the Zuid-Afrikahuis something new? Or do we want to appeal to and engage a whole new, more diverse group around the Zuid-Afrikahuis? And if we want both, of course we want both. How do we do that? And is it possible at all? So while working on our volume, we realized that the Zuid-Afrikahuis is still in the middle of a shift in discourse, and that white supremacy and identification with a white nationalist mindset still come into play. A counting example of this can be found in the interview with my highly esteemed colleague, Sjors Haring, and the graduate historian Joppe Bastiaanse in the glossy celebrating the 100th anniversary of the Zuid-Afrikahuis, in which the racialized element of stamverwantschap is completely ignored, and the so-called language tie between Dutch and Afrikaans is emphasized. Finally, I would like to quote the words cited in our volume of Koleka Potuma. She writes in her collective Amnesia from 2017, storytelling is, quote, how we archive, how we inherit the world. And she adds that decolonizing the archive means recognizing why some stories have been privileged over others, which makes it an ongoing exercise in space making for other stories and other storytellers. And that is exactly our aim of the volume. So we hope you will, when it's there, enjoy after its release. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Barbara, for that. And we look forward to seeing these ideals realized. Rosé, would you like to say something about your exhibition project?
So the exhibition project is very much in line with the volume, in that we're trying to open up the house and invite people that were not here before back into the house, acknowledging and kind of speaking towards like the ignored parts, the looking at those unwritten stories, at the forbidden files, the if files, bringing all of that to light and looking at the story that it tells, but also the story that it does not tell, and seeing if we can like create a narrative, rework the narrative, looking at the violences that was done in the past. Like Barbara said, we inherit a history and it moves with us. So looking at that history and then seeing how it has reworked in your own life, how it has either defined you or shaped you, and how you can remold it. So it's looking at what is the narrative, and then what is the narrative to me, and then how I could make it my own narrative, being from a marginalized place or a personal place as well. So not leaving history up to the big books, but bringing it down to a personal level. So, and then the house itself is part of the colonial structures and products of apartheid, of stamverwantskap. So it's just acknowledging that and showing that in the past this was, but this is how we are now, and then looking at the past that was also erased, bringing that back up. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. So one of the writers that I think informs my thinking about archive and what the work of archive entails is Vern Harris. And his writing on Ghosts of Archive enumerates many ways in which archives are haunted. I think the haunting of archives is something that's been explored many kinds of literature. So on the one hand, we are haunted by those who are left out of the archives, but we're also haunted by those who have not been treated justly in the archives. So we also have ghosts of the past, And as Harris makes us aware that there are those who are through archive turned into what Esther Perrin calls living ghosts, or Achille Mbembe calls the living dead. I'm interested to hear maybe from you that when we speak about these untold stories in these archives, which silences, which forms of silence, which ghosts were you perhaps most prompted by or moved by? How do you understand the temporal locatedness, perhaps, of some of these ghosts that you are trying to address through the work? I'm going to ask Rosé to start on that.
So for me, it was quite prevalent going through the archives that there are so many ghosts and so many untold stories in the archive, but also a form of rage and a form of see me, I am here, see me, I've been hurt, help me, tell my story, bring me forward. You see it yells as you move through the pictures. You see where you can resonate in it. And these are not just ghosts of marginalized people or hurt people, but these are also your pictures of your mainstream stories, your heroes. You have a few pictures where you see the war heroes. They are put in this, like, for example, the Kruger painting. After a while, I say, if you call on something so much, it becomes tired. Its soul becomes worn out. You feel the tiredness of this legacy, the weight. You don't see the person anymore. So that springs out to you. And that tells you, add this story. Tell it wasn't just me. It's not just on my shoulders, but it is a collective that we didn't get here by ourselves. Yeah.
Beautiful. I like that very much, of the tiredness of the legacy, and I think it cuts both ways in a sense, because as we press people into becoming heroic on the one hand or anti-heroic on the other hand, we flatten them as figures, and I think that there's also an injustice in that flattening, and we start belaboring particular figures also with this weight, and I think you've drawn our attention to that very beautifully. Barbara, how would you respond to that?
In a different way. Well, I'm thinking of the ghost of the Ossowa. We were confronted, when I first came in at Zuid-Afrikahuis, the Ossowa was still standing here downstairs somewhere in a corner. I never really took attention to it. It was also okay. But then we got the work of Tantraal and Ronalda. They in their work for our volume, they made clear in such a subtle way how they felt unwelcome being confronted with only this Ossowa, and then there was so much more in the house. So it confronted us with something self-evident for us. Oh, well, there's a thing, and it didn't mean very much, but it does mean a completely other thing for other persons, especially from South Africa, and especially the non-white South Africans. So this was for us, all three of us, I think, a very strong moment of teaching, of being taught, let's say it that way, that these objects have a ghost, have a story, have different stories for different people, and how important it is to make that visible and readable in order to open up the space.
And I think also that the like archives, there's often this assumed transparency that these objects in some way are just continue as they were in the past, they are just here now. But I think, it was Rosé's work and what you are talking about now, these different lenses that are brought to bear on objects and documents do also change what can be made visible from them. And I wanted to go back to something also, Barbara, that you picked up in your introduction, and it goes to the audience of this work and how we might think about convening audiences. So on the one hand, you're talking about a volume that will be published, and the kind of audience that a published volume, convenes might be kind of scholarly, or at least people who would be interested in reading long text or so on. But how does that? Yeah. Okay. But at the same time, an audience for a volume does not necessarily immediately translate into an audience for the Zuid-Afrikahuis, which also brings me more to Rosé's project of thinking about, how does the work that you do, how have you thought about audience, and how this facade, which I always feel very much when I walk down the canals, so these facades are so imposing and almost, wall-like. And part of the reason I'm thinking about audience is not only because I think that there's such a thing as an audience, but also because audience itself is often quite vertical. And here, I mean, in terms of generations. So I was also wondering about generational differentiation in audience. So recently, when we were working on the Capex Utrecht exhibition with Nancy Hour and the Black Archives, one of the things that emerged is that in relation to South Africa, there's not really a memory community here. There's not someone, if in relation to other previously colonized or continuously colonized spaces, that there's something of a lack of a memory community. And I think the space that seems to be obvious where that should contribute to that, or should contribute to making that happen, is this house. And that through thinking about a memory community then is also thinking generationally. So that when we think about, for example, Fees Must Fall, Roads Must Fall movements, a lot of the leaders in that movement were born frees, so to speak. And that there was contestation about memory and what it means to decolonize among generations as well. But I think that is kind of part of the vital work of this, is to constantly reconstitute and understand, not to accept a particular kind of framing and then just try and pull it through. So I'm going to ask Rosé maybe to think a little bit about how some of these ideas around audience, with all these considerations, impact how you are going about your project.
So before I started the project, I kind of immersed myself in it. Africa is looking at the people that are drawn to it, looking at the current group, the current people that engage, come to the conferences, come to just engage with the house. I looked at who visits the library. I asked the librarians, what do they come to visit for? And for everyone, it's more or less a different reason, but it all comes down to there's a story that they need to find, and they can find it in the archives, whether it be a Dutch person, a German person, Swedish person. They come and find a story, they look for a specific thing in the archive. And they have their own way of relating to it, young and old. And some people actually have relationships to South Africa as well. And there it's quite interesting, because when I spoke to a few of the elderly people that come to the house, you see that they have a totally different story, a totally different living memory of South Africa than what I have and what you also have. So that for me was something quite interesting. In the complete exhibition, I ask a lot of questions as to what does this mean to you? How do you make sense of it? How does this? So kind of to foster that that link again. But it seems in the house, it's not very touched. It's not very linkable, where there's a lot of programs going on with, okay, so there's now interchangeable stories. But we tried to bring it in the exhibition as well. We did interviews with uh, someone in the audience right now, Peter du Plessis, with yourself as well, and one of the board members, to kind of link those memories and bring those ideas of the past, ideas of archives, and bring it up and have them speak to each other, because it's different generations going on, it's different stories coming together.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Barbara, how are you thinking about these things?
Well, what I just said was, I think we are in the middle of a change of discourse. And this doesn't make it more easy for the volume to address a certain public. And this is, we became aware of that as well in our conversations with the authors, that we are very much aware of that history is not something which belongs to the past, but it is in the present. Still, some of the main figures in the history of the Zuid-Afrikahuis belonged to a discourse of the past. And how do you deal with their position in those times without trying to make a kind of gray zone acceptance of? So this is more our struggle, I think, with our volume, that we are very much aware of these changes of discourse, and that some of the potential public we want to reach will not be able to follow it, and for others it won't go far enough.
Okay. Yes, and I understand what you're saying. I'm trying to, I think the discourse changed drastically last week, Wednesday, as well. And I'm trying to think about how we go forward with this work now. And so there's another shift being said for you in that. There was elections in the Netherlands, and that person, when his party became the largest party in the Netherlands.
You're absolutely right. This is we don't know how this is going to work out, but that it will have an influence on also the practice of a Zuid-Afrikahuis.
Yeah.
Could I maybe interject here, because
I'm sorry to have brought that
no,
this, but I think it is some. I'm sorry I had to interrupt you, but it is something that was quite heavy on my mind as I was coming here today.
I think it's like, as something drastically changed on Wednesday, not just in the Netherlands, but across the world, we see a lot more right-wing parties coming up and a lot more polarizing of the world. But I think this is also a good reason for us to start looking into the gray zone, not shying away from choosing one side or the other, but seeing how we can integrate, intermingle, how we can talk to each other, how we can coexist, how we can like grow from it. Because at the end of the world, we don't live as the left and right. Like the panel on water said, that it's not just one specific or one solid all the time. Is that we move, you become gas-like, something traps you, you become a water, you can freeze. It's the different movements, and all it takes is that drop to change the whole current.
I'm going to try and hold on to some of your hopefulness, I must say. We only have about 5 minutes left. That's fine. Keep looking at my phone, not because I'm doing but I'm interested also in the role that objects play in both of your projects. The object is that which remains to some degree. It is not only the thing, but it is also a remnant. And so when we, I was in conversation with Rosa earlier. I was also thinking about the time that you've spent in this archive and in this collection, coming across photographs, and about how, how particular encounters surface, make certain things legible. And then through the work of convening, which I think both of your projects are doing, it's not a single encounter that you're presenting, but a set of encounters that you and others, and there's this network of engagement with these objects. So I'm curious to hear, maybe as a prelude, or kind of as we have to close soon, but maybe thinking about this that remains, that this house remains, this collection remains, these objects remains, and what bringing together these kinds of constellations of encounter, where can that take us, and how does that position the object in relation to your practice? Barbara, maybe you should start.
Well, to start off with, as a historian, I'm interested in objects, but I haven't learned to really analyze them. So this volume editing work was really something new for me, and I started looking at objects in a very more complicated way. And well, Peter is here, and he has a lovely contribution about the Zassem room, the bestuurs room, where a lot of more objects are there, varying from a Zulu shield to the portrait of Kruger and more. And also the placing of objects in such a room, and how to analyze that was really, for me, important to learn from, and to learn how you can. It was also important because it made me think about how can you change it? How can you change the meaning of objects by just changing the position in relation to each other? So.
Yeah, that's the curator's strategy of juxtaposition, and so important. It is so important, and I think it's interesting in relation to thinking about this constellation of encounters. Is what does one juxtapose with what? Yeah, very interesting. Beautiful.
For me, I think the remnants of an object is quite interesting. Seeing an object out of context, but also in context, and then the different stories that comes from it out of context, because it will never have the same meaning or function as when it was within its own circumstances. So what I was thinking while Barbara was talking is object isolated and object engaging. So it's all from where you stand. So the Osava, like you pointed out in the essay, it was a point of violence for a lot of people, and I rightfully so understand it. It also angers me. But then it could also be flipped and say that, oh, this is what has happened, but this is how I persevered through this. This is how we still managed to come out. So it brings that, it has a new subjectivity once it's out of it's like normal, or it's made context. So that whole play on it, and I always like to think of objects once it's like 100 years from now, out of context, nobody knows what it is, and then it gets reinvented, so that new life that it's built in it, that you can have that agency to make that new life.
I have a exercise that I like to do with students or groups or audiences, and I have a picture of the Makapansgat pebble. I don't know if any of you know the Makapansgat pebble, and I just show them the picture and I say, right, you have to write the label for this object, and what do you need to know to write this label? And it's always very interesting to see that in the writing of the label, in this the knowledge. People like to talk about knowledge production, but there we are sitting actually producing knowledge, like tick, 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 tick. So yes, no, absolutely. I really like also what you were saying about the, this ambivalence of the object almost hovering between, on the one hand, its ties to, and the reason we kind of resonate with an object is because of its ties to the pastness, but it can never, it's never exactly in that thing. So there's we also have to account for the kind of temporal shift of encountering the object in the present, which is, I think, part of the work of curatorship and scholarship, and that both of your projects are taking on.
May I add?
Yes, please go.
I think we need a lot of humor as well with these objects. Oh, sorry. I think we need a lot of humor in relation to these objects, that we are going to really play with them, what you said as well, play in a joyful way in order to bring new context, new meaning to them.
Yeah, and I think through that meaning making, I think that's in a sense how we're making our present world as well. Yeah. Margriet, I'm going to take my cue from you now. We are finished with our time. Do we have questions from the audience maybe, or
we are over time.
over time? Okay. All right.
First, let me thank.
Oh, okay. I wasn't. Exit or do we?
Yeah. Okay, because thank you so much to the three of you for this really fantastic discussion. I'm looking forward to the concrete products, the exhibition and the publication, but also to continue this discussion, Karina, because also from a curator's perspective, I think there's much more to be explored also in what we have done now and how things can be taken on in the future. So please let us continue with this discussion. But for the time, thank you so much for your contribution here this afternoon. All right, I was planning on allowing people from the audience to ask questions, but it's also my privilege then as a chair to say we don't have time for that. But we will continue the discussion in the room next door, where we will have some drinks with compliments by the Zuid-Afrikahuis. Anjali, thank you so much for offering that. Before we go and before we say goodbye to everyone, I would just like to say thank you to Jamie for all her support and for the technical. Thank you, Jamie, for everything you do. You are behind the screens, but really without you, and now also we are not even looking at each other because she's hiding behind the screen of a huge monitor behind which she's sort of placing herself. But without this, we couldn't do this, without your help and without your know-how and your competence with all this technique. So thank you so much. Werner, thank you so much for... Wessel, sorry. I just met him this afternoon, so... Wessel, thank you so much for preparing and getting everything ready for us there in the back room. We really appreciate it very much. And Anjali, thank you so much for hosting the session, the symposium here this afternoon in the Zuid-Afrikahuis. We are really glad to be here and to be having these conversations. To everyone who watched, thank you so much. For the people who attended, thank you so much. But a very, very special thank you to all the participants in these conversations this afternoon. Thank you so much also to those online, Bibi and Azil. I really appreciate your time and for being here. I have a small thank you for you, but it hasn't been delivered on time for all kinds of bureaucratic reasons. So please, it's forthcoming. Thank you very much.